At sunset, when dust settles on empty streets and saloon signs creak in the wind, a lone bandit hatched a plan for a heist that'd change his life. The bank looked deserted, the night promised silence, and the scheme seemed foolproof, until a shadow with a revolver and a mocking grin appeared at the door. That night spun a tale this frontier town would talk about for years, and here's why it's worth your ear. Hey listener, how's it going and where you tuning in from? Stick around to hear how one dumb idea can turn into a Wild West legend. The sun hung over the horizon, dragging its feet before giving way to night, while the dusty town of Dry Bone looked like time had forgotten it a decade ago. The street, stretched between two rows of sagging wooden buildings, was empty except for a couple of drunk cowboys bickering outside the saloon about whose horse was faster. Jack Crow, a man with hawk-sharp eyes and a reputation that smelled of gunpowder, sat in the shade of an old store's porch studying the bank across the way. The bank was small, its signs paint peeling, looking as sleepy as the rest of this nowhere town. Jack tugged his hat lower to shield his face from prying eyes and let his thoughts wander. His life, a string of wandering debts and barroom brawls, had been begging for a change. He was tired of sleeping under the stars, chewing jerky, and dodging the law through thorny brush. The bank in Drybone seemed like easy pickings. One guard, some old geezer, and rumors that the safe was near empty since the town hadn't seen real money since the last gold rush. Jack figured this was his shot. Nightfall, a dark coat, a few slick moves. He dried out with full pockets, leaving Drybone in the dust. Dust swirled around his boots as he stood, brushed off his pants, and took one last look at the bank. A wagon rumbled by, hauling water barrels, and the driver, an old man with a beard like a gray tumbleweed, shot Jack a suspicious glance. Jack just smirked back as if to say, "Mind your own, old-timer." The town droned on with its lazy rhythm. Women hung laundry, a couple of kids chucked rocks at a tin can, and a mournful piano tune drifted from the saloon. Nobody paid much mind to the stranger in the worn hat, which suited Jack just fine. His plan was as straightforward as a shot point blank. Wait till the town slept, sneak to the bank, pick the lock, he'd done it before in other backwater holes, and walk away with the cash. The safe, word had it, was old, the lock rusty, so it'd be quick work. Jack slipped a hand into his pocket, feeling the familiar weight of his folding knife and the battered revolver that hadn't failed him in 5 years. He wasn't planning to kill anyone, but out here you kept your gun ready. Drybone seemed quiet, but on the Wild West, quiet could be a lie. Jack headed toward the saloon, figuring he'd kill time till night with a glass of whiskey. The Rusty Nail Saloon hit Jack Crow with the smell of cheap whiskey and stale tobacco, as lively inside as a henhouse before a storm. The wooden tables, darkened by time, hosted a handful of regulars, a couple of cowboys, a gambler with a worn deck, and a farmer who looked like he'd slept in his hat. Jack pushed his way to the bar, where the bartender, a bald hulk with a face like cracked clay, lazily wiped a glass. Jack ordered whiskey, tossed a few coins on the counter, and settled in to keep an eye on the door and the window facing the bank. The whiskey burned his throat, but Jack just grimaced, mulling over his plan. The bank sat right across the street, and through the saloon's window, he watched the last clerk lock up and shuffle off, dragging his feet like he was hauling the whole day behind him. Rumors that the safe was near empty only stoked Jack's excitement. Less loot meant less trouble. He could already picture himself riding out of Drybone with enough cash for a fresh start somewhere in California, where nobody knew his name. "More whiskey?" The bartender grunted, snapping Jack out of his thoughts. Jack nodded, flashing a grin, and decided to loosen the man's tongue. "Heard your bank ain't exactly swimming in gold," he said, playing it like he was just bored. The bartender snorted, setting the bottle down. "Rich? The mice in there starved to death. Old Burns, the guard, sleeps sounder than a log. Want money? Rob a whiskey wagon. You'll at least get drunk." Jack laughed like the joke was actually funny, but inside he was singing. If even the bartender thought the bank was an easy mark, what could go wrong? At a nearby table, the gambler started arguing loudly with a cowboy over a lost bet, and Jack caught snippets of their talk. "The bank? Ain't been touched in 10 years, the cowboy muttered, shuffling cards. "Sheriff Logan's sharp, though, but he's usually haunting saloons." Jack took a sip, hiding a smile. A sheriff who liked his liquor was music to his ears. He could already see himself in the saddle, a sack of coins in hand, tearing off into the night while the town slept. But the thrill in his chest mixed with a faint unease. Jack took another swig, watching the lantern shadows dance on the street outside. He wasn't new to this game, but something about this town, maybe the quiet or the locals' indifferent stares, made him shift in his seat. He brushed it off, blaming the cheap booze. The plan was too simple to fail. Darkness fell over Dry Bone like someone had draped a black blanket over the town, leaving only the stars and the dim glow of saloon lanterns. Jack Crow stepped out of the rusty nail, adjusted his hat, and breathed in the dry night air, thick with dust and the faint stench of horse manure. The street was deserted. Only a dog barked somewhere far off, and the wind whistled, brushing against sagging signs. He moved toward the bank, sticking to the shadows where the light wouldn't catch his steps. His heart was pounding faster than he'd expected, but Jack chalked it up to the whiskey and the chill seeping through his thin jacket. The plan was simple: get to the bank's back door in the alley where no one passed and pick the lock. He'd done it before, in other nowhere towns. A couple of minutes with his knife, and the lock would give like a cheap saloon girl. The bank looked dead. No light in the windows, no sound of footsteps. The old guard, if the bartender was right, was sleeping inside, and Jack had no intention of waking him. He paused at the alley, pressing against the store's wall, and scanned the street again. Nothing. Even the dog had gone quiet, like it knew now wasn't the time to make a fuss. Jack pulled out his folding knife, checked the revolver in his holster, and crept toward the door. The wooden frame looked ancient, paint peeling, and the lock gleamed in the moonlight, almost taunting him. He slid the knife into the slot, twisted, and the lock clicked so easily that Jack froze, hardly believing his luck. The door opened without a creak, and he slipped inside, moving as quietly as he could. The bank smelled of dust and old paper, the darkness so thick he could barely make out the teller's counter. Jack pulled out a small lantern, cupping his hand over it to hide the light, and headed for the safe in the corner. His boots echoed in the silence, and he cursed under his breath, forcing himself to move slower. Everything was going too smoothly, and that was starting to gnaw at him. He knelt before the safe, pressed his knife to the lock, and started working. The metal scraped, but gave way, just like the rumors promised. Jack grinned, picturing himself riding out a Dry Bone in an hour with cash in hand. He could already see himself in a new suit, on a good horse, in a town free of dust and sheriffs. But then, somewhere in the dark, a revolver's hammer clicked and his blood turned to ice. The click of the hammer hit Jack Crow's nerves like a hammer on an anvil, and he froze, still clutching the knife at the safe's lock. His lantern's light trembled, giving away his position, and he quickly blew it out, plunging the room into inky darkness. The silence grew so heavy it felt like you could cut it with a blade. Jack straightened slowly, hand on his revolver, squinting to make out who or what waited in the corner. "Don't twitch, friend," came a voice, low and steady, with a hint of mockery, like its owner was savoring the moment. "Or a hole in your hat will be the last thing you regret." Jack turned his head and saw a shadow seated in a chair against the wall. Moonlight slipping through a crack in the curtain lit up the figure. Sheriff Logan, revolver in hand, smiling like he'd just won a poker game. His boots rested on a crate, hat tipped back slightly, revealing eyes that gleamed like a coyote's spotting prey. Jack swallowed, but tried to keep his face calm, like he'd been caught stealing apples, not breaking into a bank. "Sheriff," he said, dragging out the words to buy time, "you guarding banks at night now? Nothing better to do?" Logan chuckled, not moving an inch, though his finger rested on the trigger. "Oh, I got plenty to do," he replied, "like catching clever types like you who think Dry Bone's their personal piggy bank." Jack tried to grin, but it came out somewhere between a grimace and a snarl. His brain scrambled for an out, bolt for the door, draw his gun, or talk his way free. The last option seemed least likely to get him killed. "Listen, Logan," he started, aiming for friendly. "I was just checking if everything's secure. Heard the lock's weak. Thought I'd, lend a hand." The sheriff laughed, a sound as dry as the street's dust. "Lend a hand? You're a regular saint, except that knife in your grip says you're more about safes than good deeds." The tension in the room thickened, but Logan wasn't in a rush. He eyed Jack like a cat watching a mouse that hadn't yet realized it was caught. Sweat trickled down Jack's back, his fingers tightening on his revolver's grip, but he knew the sheriff was faster. All he had was words, so he leaned on them. "How about a deal?" he offered, raising an eyebrow. "I walk out, you forget you saw me. Nobody gets hurt." Logan leaned forward, his smile widening. "Oh, your pride's gonna hurt, son, and trust me, that'll sting worse than a bullet." The darkness in the bank pressed on Jack Crow like the walls were closing in. While he stood, gripping the revolver he didn't dare draw, Sheriff Logan sat in his chair like a king on a throne, that same mocking smile grating on Jack's nerves worse than a creaking wagon at dawn. Logan didn't shoot, didn't move, just watched, and his calm was more insulting than any threat. Jack could feel his pride cracking, but he still hoped to turn this around. "You know how many tried robbing this bank?" Logan started, his voice steady but laced with tired sarcasm, like a man telling the same story for the 10th time. 5. All 5 thought they were smarter than everyone else, and all 5 are either in jail or fertilizing cacti outside town. He paused, tapping a finger on his revolver's grip. You look set to be number 6. What's your pitch, genius? Jack clenched his jaw, heat rising to his face. He hated being called a fool, especially when it rang true. I ain't the type to repeat other people's mistakes, Sheriff, he shot back, trying to sound confident, though his voice betrayed a quiver. He took a step sideways, testing if Logan would follow, but the sheriff just narrowed his eyes, staying put. Mistakes? Logan snorted. Your plan ain't a mistake, it's a comedy. You bust into a bank where I'm sitting like it's a fishing hole waiting for fellas like you. That's not a mistake, son, it's a punchline. Jack tried to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. He felt like a kid caught stealing pie, not a bandit with a gun. Logan went on like he was giving a lecture. See, folks in Drybone are simple. They don't like thieves, but they love stories about fools who think they can outsmart me. You're already a star, Crow. You just don't know it yet. Jack ground his teeth, his fingers trembling with anger, but he held himself in check. Drawing his gun now would be suicide. Logan looked like the kind who shot faster than he talked. Maybe I ain't a genius, Jack finally managed, but I'm not giving up just 'cause you're sitting there cracking wise. He took another step toward the door, gauging the sheriff's reaction. Logan just shook his head like a teacher disappointed in a student. Run if you want, he said, but know this. It's gonna be a long night, and I ain't the one who tires first. Silence hung between them, and Jack realized his plan was crumbling, with the sheriff playing him like a puppet. Jack Crow stood in the bank's darkness, sweat chilling his temples, while Sheriff Logan watched him with a smile that promised more trouble than a bullet. The silence rang in his ears, and Jack knew retreating was no longer an option. His pride, like an old horse, refused to quit, even if pushing on was plain stupid. He figured if he couldn't outshoot the sheriff, he might outsmart him. After all, he'd talked his way out of tight spots before, leaning on his tongue and sheer nerve. Logan, you don't want a shootout in your little town, Jack started, trying to sound like they were old pals sharing a beer. Noise, mess, paperwork for your reports. Let me walk, and we both forget this night. He took another step toward the door, keeping his hands visible to avoid sparking a shot. Logan narrowed his eyes, but his revolver stayed steady. Walk, the sheriff echoed, his voice as dry as the sand underfoot. You already walked in, fella. Now it's not just a night, it's your reputation. And trust me, it won't smell like roses. Jack felt anger bubbling in his chest. He hated being cornered, especially by words. You think I'll just roll over? He snapped, his voice sharper than he meant. I ain't the kind to run with my tail tucked. Logan laughed, and the sound stung like a slap. Roll over? You're already neck deep, Crow. Your only choice is how you want to be a laughingstock, with a hole in your chest, or a story they'll tell in saloons. Jack clenched his fists, his fingers itching to grab his revolver, but he knew that'd be the end. Instead, he tried a bluff. Maybe you're the sheriff, but one shot, and I'll drop you before you blink, he said, hoping his bravado sounded convincing. Logan just shook his head like he'd heard it 1,000 times. Go ahead and try, he replied, a glint in his eyes. But I don't shoot to miss. You, though, you already missed, picking this bank. The situation was turning absurd. Jack realized his words were only amusing the sheriff, like a bad stage show. He took another step toward the door, but his movements weren't as sure now. His thoughts tangled. Run, fight, or keep talking? Logan, as if reading his mind, added, Run if you want, but the crowd outside's already waiting for a show, and I ain't talking about the stars overhead. Jack froze, realizing his plan, so simple back in the saloon, had turned into a farce where he was the head clown. Jack Crow felt his patience snap like an overstretched guitar string, and in a split second, his hand went for his revolver. He wasn't about to let Sheriff Logan's mocking grin win, not when it felt like a personal insult. One quick shot, he thought, and he'd either be the hero of his own story or a dead man. But he couldn't stand there taking humiliation any longer. His fingers closed around the grip, and he lunged to the side, hoping the move would throw Logan off. A shot rang out, tearing through the silence like thunder on a clear day, and Jack's bullet shattered a glass lampshade above the teller's counter. Shards rained down, and Logan, not missing a beat, fired back, his bullet punching through a wooden panel 2 steps from Jack. Neither hit their mark, but the bank came alive with noise, dust, and curses. Jack dove behind the counter, his heart pounding like it wanted to break free, his mind stuck on one thought. Why the hell did I start this? Seriously? Logan shouted, his voice a mix of irritation and amusement. You shoot worse than my aunt with a hangover. He rolled behind a crate in the corner, still holding his revolver ready but not firing again. Jack popped up, squeezed off another shot, and the bullet buried itself in the ceiling, kicking up a cloud of plaster. Logan's laugh hit harder than a bullet. Crow, you ain't a robber, you're a clown, he yelled. Drop the gun before you wreck the whole bank. Jack clenched his jaw, his face burning with anger and shame. He fired again, this time splintering a chair into pieces. Logan returned fire, his bullet chewing up the counter Jack hid behind. The shootout felt more like a drunken brawl than a duel. Bullets flew everywhere but their targets, and the bank was turning into a junkyard of broken furniture and glass. Jack cursed under his breath, realizing his brilliant plan now looked like a cheap circus act. The gunfire woke the street outside, and Jack heard voices gathering. Curious townsfolk drawn by the racket. Logan, still behind his crate, called out, "You wanted fame, Crow?" "Congrats, now the whole town knows your name." Jack leaned out to snap back, but Logan's next bullet whizzed so close it warmed his cheek. He dropped back behind the counter, breathing hard, and realized this night wasn't just a failure, it was a disaster he'd brought on himself. The gunfire in the bank died down, but the street outside came alive like someone kicked an anthill. Jack Crow, still pressed against the teller's counter, heard the crowd gathering. Voices, footsteps, the creak of wagon wheels. Someone shouted, "What the hell's going on in there?" And another voice, rough from whiskey, answered, "Sounds like someone's playing with Logan." Jack cursed under his breath, realizing his nighttime heist was turning into a town spectacle, with him as the prime target for ridicule. Through the bank's shattered window, snippets of chatter drifted in. "That's the stranger from the saloon," someone muttered, probably the bartender who'd poured Jack's whiskey a couple of hours back. "Said the bank was empty, then went to check it himself, I reckon." The crowd buzzed and someone snickered. "Empty? He's gonna be the empty one when Logan's done with him." Jack clenched his jaw, his pride buckling under the weight of their laughter. He still gripped his revolver, but every thought of firing again felt dumber than the last. Inside the bank, Sheriff Logan, still behind his crate, called out, "Crow, you hear that? You've got an audience. Want to step out and take a bow?" His voice dripped with sarcasm, and Jack felt heat flood his face. He peeked over the counter, trying to gauge the situation, but saw only the crowd's shadows flickering in the moonlight outside. Folks weren't rushing in. They knew better than to meddle in Logan's business in Drybone, where it was riskier than poking a rattlesnake. But curiosity pulled them closer, and Jack realized he'd become their free entertainment. "Sheriff, you wake the whole town just to make me look bad," Jack shouted, aiming for defiance, but his voice shook with anger and exhaustion. Logan snorted, staying put. "Make you look bad? You're doing fine on your own, son. I'm just watching you dig your own grave." Outside, someone in the crowd clapped, and a woman's voice rang out, "If he's that big a fool, least he can entertain us before jail." Laughter rolled through the crowd, and Jack felt like he was being kicked without anyone laying a hand on him. He glanced at the door, which now seemed farther away than it had at the start of the night. Dust from the broken furniture settled on the floor, and the air hung heavy with the smell of gunpowder. The crowd outside grew louder, and someone yelled, "Hey, robber, show your face! We want to remember the hero!" Jack ground his teeth, realizing every move he made was now part of a story Drybone would chew on for years. His plan, so simple back in the saloon, had become a trap, and all he could do was decide how he wanted to lose. Jack Crow pressed against the teller's counter, his heart hammering like a blacksmith's mallet, while the crowd's voices outside buzzed louder, like a swarm of stirred-up bees. Dust from the wrecked furniture still hung in the air, and the smell of gunpowder tickled his nose, a reminder that his heist plan now felt like a bad dream. Staying in the bank was like sitting in a mousetrap, and he knew his only shot at saving a shred of pride was to run. Jack glanced at the door, beckoning like a mirage in the desert, and decided he'd rather take his chances than become Drybone's punchline. He bolted for the exit, ducking low to avoid being an easy target for Logan, who still sat behind his crate with that damned smirk. A bullet from the sheriff whistled over Jack's head, splintering the doorframe, but he didn't stop. He shoved the door with his shoulder and stumbled into the street where the cold night air hit him along with dozens of curious eyes. The crowd gathered in front of the bank hummed like a fairground seeing the star of this absurd show. "There's the robber!" someone shouted, and laughter sliced through the street, sharp as a razor. Jack tripped on a step, nearly falling, his face burning with shame. People stood in the lantern shadows, the bartender from the Rusty Nail, a couple of cowboys, an old woman in a nightgown, even a kid with a stick, staring at him like he was a circus bear. "Run, fella, before Logan shoots you!" a drunken voice hollered, and the crowd roared with laughter again. Jack clenched his jaw, his hand still gripping his revolver, but shooting into the crowd would be madness. He tore down the street, hoping to lose himself in an alley, but every step drew more jeers. "Where you hurrying to, hero?" a woman called from the saloon's porch. "Safe's empty, and you're still the fool." Jack felt his pride crumbling like an old barn in a windstorm. He turned a corner, but another surprise waited. A few onlookers, drawn by the gunshots, had already blocked the alley like they were waiting for the show's finale. Their faces, lit by lanterns, brimmed with glee, and Jack realized there was nowhere to run. Drybone had become an arena, and he was the star loser. He stopped, breathing hard, and looked back. The crowd's shadows closed in, and somewhere behind, he heard Logan's calm footsteps, as if the sheriff wasn't even in a hurry. Jack realized his escape wasn't salvation, it was just another act in this comedy, where every step only fed the crowd's laughter. Jack Crow stood in the alley, breathing hard, his revolver now feeling like a useless hunk of iron in his hand. The crowd blocking the exit stared at him like a cornered animal, their faces gleaming with glee under the dim lantern light. Laughter and whispers swarmed around him like flies, each chuckle cutting deeper than a blade. Jack glanced around, desperate for a gap to slip through, but the slow, steady footsteps of Sheriff Logan were already closing in from the darkness. Logan stepped out of the shadows, his revolver still in hand but pointed at the ground, as if he knew he wouldn't need to fire. His eyes glinted like a man who just won a chess game without making a single wasted move. "Crow," he said, his voice calm, almost lazy. "You ran like a rabbit, but forgot every road in Drybone leads to me." The crowd buzzed, someone even whistled, and Jack felt his throat tighten with humiliation. "You think this is all a game?" Jack snapped, his voice shaking with anger, still trying to save face. Logan shrugged, his smile unshaken. "A game? Nah, son, it's a lesson. You thought you'd rob the bank and ride off into the sunset like some dime novel hero. But here's the funny part. I knew you were coming the moment you sipped whiskey in the saloon." Jack froze, his thoughts stumbling like a horse on a rock. The bartender, the cowboys, their talk of an empty bank. It all felt like bait now, and he'd swallowed it like a starving fish. Logan stepped closer, and the crowd hushed, sensing the finale. "See, in this town, rumors spread faster than wildfire," the sheriff went on. "Soon as you mentioned the bank, I was sitting here, sipping coffee, wondering just how dumb you'd be." Jack clenched his fists, his fingers trembling, but words failed him. Logan hadn't just outplayed him, he'd done it so thoroughly that Jack felt like a puppet whose strings were pulled from the start. "So, what now, Sheriff?" Jack finally rasped, his voice rough like he'd swallowed sand. "Gun me down in front of everyone to give him a show?" Logan shook his head, his smile almost pitying. "Gun you down? Why bother? You've already killed yourself, Crow. Your story's gonna live on in saloons, and that's worse than any bullet." The crowd stirred again, and someone shouted, "Lock him up, Logan. Let him stew on his fame." Jack realized his defeat was final, and all he had left was to face it with whatever scraps of dignity remained. Jack Crow stood in the middle of the alley, surrounded by a crowd whose jeers stung like a swarm of wasps on a hot afternoon. His revolver hung heavy and useless in his hand, his dusty boots rooted to the ground, as if the town itself refused to let him go. The faces of the townsfolk, bartender, cowboys, even the old woman from the saloon's porch, glowed with wicked delight, like they were watching the best show of their lives. Jack felt his pride crumbling like sand in the wind, each chuckle from the crowd a blow to his already fractured ego. Sheriff Logan stepped closer, his pace slow, almost lazy, his revolver now tucked in its holster, as if Jack wasn't worth a bullet anymore. "Drop the iron, Crow," Logan said, his voice steady but tinged with mockery, like a man who knew he'd already won. "You've played your part. Time to end the show." Jack clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening on the grip, but he knew resistance was pointless. He let go, and the gun hit the dust with a dull thud, like the final note of his failure. The crowd buzzed, someone even clapped, as if Jack had just pulled off a circus trick. "That's it, hero," a drunken cowboy shouted, his words drowned in a fresh burst of laughter. Logan stepped forward, picked up Jack's revolver, and tucked it into his belt, never breaking eye contact with his captive. "You thought you'd clean out Drybone and ride off into the sunset," he said, shaking his head. "Now look, you ain't even a robber, you're a joke." Jack wanted to snap back, but his throat tightened and he just looked away, unable to meet the crowd's gazes. Logan took him by the shoulder, not rough but firm, and led him through the crowd toward the small jail at the street's edge. People parted, but their whispers and snickers trailed Jack like a shadow. "Heard he thought the bank was empty," a woman giggled, holding a lantern. "Empty? His head's the empty one." Another voice shot back and the crowd roared again. Jack walked head down, feeling each step make him smaller than he'd been at the night's start. When they reached the jail, Logan opened the cell door and gave Jack a slight push inside. "Sleep it off, Crow," he said, locking the bars. "Tomorrow this town will be talking about you, but not the way you hoped." The door clanged shut and Jack was left alone, staring at the dusty cell floor. The crowd's laughter still echoed in his ears, and he realized this shame would haunt him longer than any time behind bars. A week had passed since that fateful night, but Drybone still buzzed like someone tossed a rock into a still pond. In the Rusty Nail Saloon, regulars gathered every evening, and the tale of Jack Crow, who tried to rob the bank and became a laughingstock, grew new details like ivy on an old fence. The bartender, wiping down the counter, added that Jack drank whiskey like a hero, but ran like a coward. Cowboys, shuffling cards, argued whether Jack missed his shots on purpose or just fired like a blind coyote. Even the old woman from the saloon's porch swore she saw Jack trip over his own feet, though she was too far to tell. In the jail, Jack sat behind bars, hearing snatches of talk carried by the wind through the small window. Each word about his failure stung like salt in a wound, but he no longer fumed, just stared at the ceiling, wondering where it all went wrong. His plan, so simple in the saloon's dim light, had been a trap he set for himself. Sheriff Logan stopped by once a day, bringing a bowl of beans and a fresh jab. "Heard your stories reached the next town, Crow." "Gonna write a book." Jack just grunted, too drained to argue. The townsfolk, though they laughed, quietly respected Logan for how he played Jack like a fiddle. The sheriff didn't just catch a robber, he did it so the whole town felt part of the win. At the saloon, they hung a new sign, and someone suggested carving "The Bank That Survived Crow" on it. The laughter was loud, but it hid a lesson. In this dusty town, greed and stupidity always ended in shame. Jack, in his cell, started to see his name was now part of local lore, but not the way he'd dreamed. He'd pictured himself a Western hero, riding into the sunset with a sack of gold, but instead became a joke told over whiskey. When they finally let him out after a month, he left Drybone without looking back, knowing the shadow of that night would follow him to every saloon he stopped at. Life in Drybone rolled on. Logan, sipping coffee in his office, sometimes chuckled, recalling how easily Jack fell for the empty bank rumors. The town kept dozing under the scorching sun, but the story of the hapless bandit became a legend, told to newcomers to warn them. In Drybone, you don't play with fate.